I wanted to talk about this essay that Tony Blair has written. It's on his Tony Blair Institute for Global Change website. It's quite long. Andy Burnham says he's read it 3 times because, you should give it appropriate attention. I can't say I've read it 3 times. I've dipped into it a few times, read it once. And I just wanted to bring some of the points from it to the podcast. I have got some quotes that I wanted to read out from it. So I wanted to talk about the essay itself and then a bit about the reaction to it. And perhaps finish off with my reactions to it, if that's okay. So the kind of background to this, the context to this, is that Tony Blair is kind of intervening in the whole crisis, can you call it, in the Labour Party? So
the perma-crisis.
The perma-crisis, yeah. But at the moment, the way that that's playing out is in terms of this. I guess it's not really a leadership contest as yet, is it? In that they're kind of pausing everything while they see if Andy Burnham can be elected, so that they can then have a leadership contest that includes him, which it all seems very self-indulgent to me. But anyway, that's the context to Tony Blair intervening. And he's intervening in a very critical way, critical of the Labour Party and of the way that they're not just running the country, but approaching this whole internal Labour Party stuff that's going on. So, first quote I wanted to pull out. He says, governments which succeed don't start with a personality contest or a political question, as in, how do we save the country from reform? They start with an idea, a project, a governing purpose, an analysis of what's wrong, and a plan to put it right. The challenge of democracy is not transparency, honesty, or conspiracy theories about the hidden power of elites. It is efficacy. It is the ability to get big things done. Now, I mean, that kind of sounds in some ways okay, doesn't it? If you want to get HS2 done, then you need a government that can get big things done. But I do think that quote just has a bit of a feel of Mussolini got the trains running on time about it, that actually it doesn't matter what you do, you just do what you have to do to get things done. And in particular, the idea that he says the challenge of democracy is not transparency or honesty. And that kind of feels to me rather taking the public for granted. Surely part of democracy should be about being transparent and honest with the electorate. And if you're saying, no, it doesn't matter how many lies you tell, as long as you get things done, that feels to me rather, that isn't what democracy is about. That's just you thinking that what you think is right and you're going to impose it on everybody, and whatever it takes to do that, that's what we'll do. So I didn't like that. That was one of his opening gambits. So, and the next thing that he talks about, which is one of the things that's been picked up on in the press quite a bit, is this word ballast. Do you know what ballast is?
Like a support beam?
Isn't it when you put weight in the bottom of a boat so it doesn't tip over?
Yeah. Okay, yeah.
So he quotes John Adams.
The president?
Yeah, second president of the US, who said, "Ballast is what I want. I totter with every breeze." And his argument, Tony Blair's argument, is that that's the problem with this government. It doesn't have ballast.
You could say what we need is strong and stable.
Strong and stable, yes, indeed. I remember that from somebody else, yes. And I think on one level that's right, but I would imagine that my view would be that what a government gets ballast from is from having an ideology, a belief system, a mandate. And it needs to get that from the public. But again, Tony Blair doesn't ever seem to, in any of this, talk about the public at all. The public never seem to come into his thinking at all. It's all very kind of managerial. So I think he imagines that ballast comes from things like an evidence base, those kind of things where, it's very technocratic and it's very expert led. So it kind of tries to take things out of the realm of politics and into the realm of experts and managerialism. And I think that's what he imagines is where the ballast comes from. So then the bit that I think has received perhaps the most attention is this idea of the radical centre. And I know, in some of the WhatsApp groups we've been in, there's a bit of a discussion about, is he right to say what's lacking is a radical centre? And are we it, almost? But I don't think that is right. So let me just tell you what he says about the radical centre. So he says, the centre, properly defined, and I should say as an aside, a lot of this is very pompous. It's kind of, I was in government for 13 years and I was re-elected 3 times and I've worked with the Trump administration. I have experience of this. And it's all very, self-indulgent on Tony Blair's part, I think. But anyway, sorry, I've gone off tangent there. The centre, properly defined, is where you put policy first and politics last. So you begin with a question, what is the right answer? And only once you have that do you engage in the political task of persuading people of it. So...
Is that his description of the centre?
That's, the centre properly defined. That's what centre is, properly defined. Now, I should say, when he says where you put policy first and politics last, it's clear from what he goes on to say that by politics there, he means internal party politics. He doesn't mean...
And like big P politics.
Big P, yeah.
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 Like manoeuvring and the... Yeah.
Exactly. Because he says later, both main parties have gone off the rails. There we go, another segue.
That's the link.
By putting internal politics first and good policy second, such as Labour moving to the left after 2007, culminating in the absurdity of the Corbyn leadership and the Tories with Brexit. So politics, he means internal party politics. So what he's saying here is that policy comes first, and I think that's bit's right. Policy should come first. But that policy should be a policy that's been crafted and worked on by an engagement and a debate with the public. And again, the public is nowhere to be seen in any of this. So all of this is very much top down. What is the right answer? It's what Tony Blair thinks the right answer is. It's that... We've said before, haven't we, that we really think that this idea of the national interest being what should motivate things is right. But so many people use those words, the national interest, to mean it's what I think the national interest is. And I think Tony Blair is doing the same thing. He's saying, what is the right answer? It's what I think is the right answer. And I will, make that the starting point. Whereas the starting point should be engagement with the public, and it should be, I'm not saying you should be driven by a focus group, but, we all need, in a democracy, we all need to be involved in a debate about what's right for the country. And that doesn't appear in this anywhere. The people never appear.
The people never appear.
Just to kind of hammer that home a little bit, and this is the bit that I found the most astounding, really, most astonishing bit in it. So he talks about the Labour Party manifesto going into the 2024 general election. And he says, due to the way the manifesto was drafted, the government took with it into power commitments, which meant there was a gap between the government rhetoric around growth and the impact of these commitments on what the business community needed to restore the so-called animal spirits and get the private sector moving. Those commitments were the new workers' rights laws, the net zero acceleration, the phasing out of British oil and gas, the uplift in the minimum wage beyond inflation, and the non-dom changes. Now, he says, the Prime Minister and the Chancellor should have said right at the outset, after being elected, These are commitments which economic circumstances have rendered unwise to proceed with. And they should have dropped the commitments. Dropping those commitments would have been painful but bearable, because government would have started with real goodwill from business. Now, is it me? I mean, is that not just astounding that he thinks, oh, yeah, you should have gone into an election with all these commitments. The minute you got elected, you should have dropped them, and that would have resulted in goodwill.
From business.
From business?
It's incredible. Yeah.
I mean, that to me is just shows such arrogance and contempt for the electorate that it just drips with, this kind of condescension and ill will towards ordinary people.
Yeah.
So that's I think probably the worst bit. So to go back to the centre again, the centre, he says, this bit I quite like. The centre should never be the place of managing the status quo. And I don't know if I sent you some things that I'd been working on yesterday, didn't I? Some kind of writing. And one thing I wrote that before I read this. One of the things I thought was quite interesting is that a lot of the language I'd used in that, if you'd done a word map of what I'd written and this, there'd be loads of overlap, but drawing absolutely the diagonally opposing conclusions. Because I do think that one of the real problems at the moment is that everybody is talking about, realistically, how do we better manage the status quo? They're not talking about the kind of fundamental change that I think everybody wants. I think there's absolute evidence that ordinary people want fundamental change in society, whereas everybody's talking about, how do we better manage this or that? I mean, even Farage, I think, is talking about how to be a better Tory party.
Yeah, 100%. And in this conversation around what are the new dividing lines, and something I said at the Battle of Ideas North was that I thought the new dividing lines might be those that want change and those that don't. And those that don't are the liberals, because we've been in a liberal world for the last 40 years. And that's why we might discuss post-liberal, right? We might label ourselves as that. And I think in some ways you have elements of that on, the so-called left, with parts of the Green Party and people that are in favour of the Green Party. You have parts of that with us and the SDP. You have parts of that in something like Restore Britain, where people are saying, no, the liberal order, actually now we need to move past that and we need to move into a new form of politics. Yeah. And so many constantly show that they're actually committed to maintaining the status quo. Yeah, they're just stuck in this, I guess you might call it the kind of post-war stasis. So certainly the post-Thatcher stasis, yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So let me going back to Tony Blair. The centre should never be the place of managing the status quo, or of splitting the difference between left and right, or of just being moderate. And I actually think if we're talking about centre politics, I think actually that is right. But remember, he's not talking about that. By the centre, he's talking about the kind of managerial centre that, makes things happen. So he says, rather, as I said earlier, the centre is the place where policy comes first and politics second. You work out the correct analysis, you being him, I think, you being the elite. You work out the correct analysis and then the correct answer, and you shape your political strategy around it. Where, therefore, the correct answer requires radical change, the centre should be the radical change maker. Now that again sounds quite, when you first read it, that sounds quite good. But when he's talking about the radical centre here, it is that managerial centre. And when he comes to his conclusions at the end, they're all very, they're not different to what anybody else is saying, really. And in fact, a lot of the things that he's saying are problematic, and perhaps this segues into the reaction to it, are things where it was the changes that Tony Blair made and Gordon Brown made in their regime that make things really difficult to do. So some of the things we've talked about already, like legal challenges to government getting things done, the ECHR. So one of the things, for example, he says you should do whatever it takes to stop the boats, stop immigration, illegal immigration. And, I think anybody would say, well, one of the problems with doing that is the possibility of challenging under the ECHR, under the refugee conventions. Did say in one of the analyses I read of his document that actually David Blunkett and Jack Straw had both argued against being part of the refugee conventions, which I didn't realise that part of Labour had thought of those things at one point. Not a point. Things to do is to look that up, really. But a lot of the things that certainly that Blair government, that Blair regime introduced are the things that make the things he's now saying we have to do very difficult to do. And that is part of the right-wing reaction. It shouldn't be right-wing, but, the kind of Tory and established party reactions. But, it's all your fault. Tony Blair is kind of what they're saying. You made all this happen. And to some extent that's true. But I still think that what they're missing is exactly the same as what he's missing is where's the public in all this?
Yeah.
Where is the ability for ordinary people to influence that agenda? Because they still seem to be stuck in their smoke-free room, it would be these days, rather than smoke-filled room. They're deciding everything about what needs to happen that has an impact on everybody's lives, and we're kind of excluded from all that. And that feels to me the real problem. So perhaps picking up on part of that, can we talk about Andy Burnham?
Yeah, sure.
So, the interesting thing about this is that it's set against the background of the Makerfield by-election.
Yeah.
This area in Wigan that Andy Burnham is contesting to try to get into Parliament so he can be part of this leadership election. And so he has reacted to this intervention. And one of the things he says, which I think is right, is it's great that we're having this debate as part of a by-election discussion. Quite right, because, that is one way in which you perhaps at least involve part of the public in this discussion. So what he says is what this essay from Tony Blair misses, and I said he's read it 3 times, he says, is the fact that living standards have flatlined. He says since 2008, I think actually you could take it back beyond there, realistically. And he says that nothing that Tony Blair is saying in all this really tackles that. The thing that they agree on, and I think we would agree as well, is that what we really need is economic growth. And part of Blair's analysis is that needs deregulation, more deregulation. So, in the same way that he was criticising those manifesto commitments that were enacted that are anti-business, Blair is saying to really generate growth, we need to be more pro-business. So we need to get rid of lots of regulation, planning restrictions, all that kind of stuff. Burnham, on the other hand, says, actually what we need is more government. We need a more interventionist government to power growth. So there's lots of these new terminologies around Andy Burnham, aren't there? So people talk about Manchesterism. I think he prefers the term good growth. So he always uses the example, doesn't he, of the Manchester buses. So Manchester buses are now all under local authority control. They're not owned by local authority, just to be clear. They are run by the private sector. Model, yeah, that's right. But, local government controls things like fare levels and timetabling and who can go where. So he uses that as an example where actually really road level government, local government intervention has driven good change. And there's something to that.
For sure, yeah.
You know, we would agree that there's lots of areas where the market doesn't work well, and we need a better state, a more competent state to intervene and to drive things like infrastructure, renewal, things like cheap energy is one of the ones that we've talked about quite a lot.
Which Tony Blair mentions, doesn't he, in his essay?
He does.
I didn't read the essay, but I saw a couple of interviews where he mentions it and says
that
he's sort of saying long-term net zero fine, but this current net zero policy is wrong.
Yes.
And he's right about that. And he mentions a couple of things that we've been saying for a long time about the fact that it's all well and good reducing your carbon emissions, but if you're just offshoring those carbon emissions...
Correct.
If you're going to be using, and he makes this argument that even the most conservative estimates say we'll need at least 15% of our energy to come from fossil fuels in 10, 20 years' time, whatever it is. He said if you're going to be using 15% of those as fossil fuels, then you might as well make them your own fossil fuels.
Correct.
And that's when we talk about the political and finding areas of agreement and arguing things, that's somewhere where you should be able to get environmentalists to agree with people that don't think climate change is a real problem. Right, that should be an area of agreement, but with an unhealthy political environment, it's very difficult.
That's right. Yeah.
Sorry, but
yeah,
that was just a segue.
Yeah. So yes, you're right. So I think we would say that there are some things that Blair is saying that we agree with, but kind of go back to what Andy Burnham's reaction was. He's arguing that we need more state, better state, more regulation. And that Tony Blair's analysis that we need less of all that is actually wrong. Now, I think at one level I agree with that. And I think if you think about the buses, things like that, that's, you know, I don't think that's like rocket science to say that that's right. But I do think there are much wider areas where I would argue that over-regulation is problematic. And I think in many areas we have this idea that, that's been deregulated. And it's not been deregulated. Regulation is just done differently. So there's lots of areas, for example, where the Bank of England is the regulator. The Bank of England at arm's length from government. So therefore that's not regulated by government. Yeah, but it's still regulated. And when somebody's regulating something and they don't have a political mandate, I think their kind of go-to place is to over-regulate and to be very risk-averse. Mm-hmm. And so that's actually, in many ways, even more problematic than direct government regulation.
And which makes perfect sense, because if you are in that position, you're going to be incentivised to over-regulate. There's not going to be a massive amount of pushback. Yeah. But if you were to under-regulate and something goes wrong, there will be.
Exactly that, yeah. So, I mean, I think there's been a lot of discussion and more heat than light, you might say, generated from this intervention by Tony Blair. The thing I would just always bring it back to is that everybody who's commenting on it, even Burnham, is not really talking about how do we as a nation decide what we want. And I think wherever debates are taking place, there is more and more, I think, a tendency to cut down the ability to which the public can contribute to those debates. So I think we talked during the local government elections about quite often now when a local government consults on something, it's an online consultation. And they might do quite a lot of comms to say, let's get that consultation out, let's get as many responses to it as we can. But that's not really a way in which the public can properly engage, I don't think, because the questions are often, I think, put together with the finger on the scale. You know, they kind of know what answers they want, and so that they kind of drive you to giving those answers. There's so many consultations I've opened, and I've kind of got to the question 3, and I've got to the stage where I'm thinking, well, nothing I say in response to question 3 will give an answer that demonstrates what my feelings are. So it's really problematic. So those kind of consultations run by local government, I think, are more and more tick box and actually very much separated from ordinary residents. I think within political parties, it's the same. So, I mean, you won't remember this, but the Labour Party conference used to be a massively contentious get together where there were massive arguments. I mean, when they got rid of Clause 4, Clause 4 is the thing that argued for state ownership of assets, nationalisation in effect. There were it was covered on the television, they were covered in the papers, all different people came with their thoughts and they all had a massive row about it in public. Yeah. And they got to a solution which not everybody agreed with, but became party policy, and the party cohered around that. And I think, if you look at the Labour Party conference today, it's very stage managed. It's the same with the TUC conference. All those debates seem to be, the idea is to have them in a closed room beforehand, and then what you present is a united front. And I think that's a real problem for political parties, because I think political parties need to be hotbeds of political debate and discussion and disagreement. And it's only by having all those arguments that you can come to a better answer. If you start off with this is the right answer, as Tony Blair seems to think, this is the correct answer, and then we'll engage politically, that's got to be a worse answer, because you've not heard from everybody who has a real stake and a real interest and a real understanding often and experience in that field. And so I think all political parties actually need to be a lot more democratic, a lot more involving of, different views from within their membership. So we talked about councils, talked about political parties, and, I think if you look at any kind of area where there's an attempt from government to find out what people think, it's very much choreographed and controlled. And there's always whenever there's because things spark off online, don't they? And you have a big furious row going on online, and people say, oh, it's so polarised. And actually, I think when we talked to Tom Slater on the podcast, he said, politics needs to be polarised. And, the kind of the other end of the spectrum is where people say, you can't have any debate about this because here's the evidence. And, that's the answer. And so there's no point in having a debate about it. And it's when you do those kind of things that I think you get real frustration and anger from people. And I think we've got to have a way that people can really be involved in those debates across society.
Okay, wow. I've got loads of thoughts.
Okay, I'll shut up for a moment.
So on, I'll try and go backwards, I might miss bits, but on the point about the Labour conference and that being a hotbed of political disagreement, I think the reason we are where we are in terms of how the parties operate is because of the incentives of what do these people that are involved want to get out of what they're doing. Essentially, how do they envisage winning? And back in the day, and I think this is true, different, it's cyclical, but back in the day, if you think about someone like Tony Benn, like his idea of winning would be to impart his vision for the country onto the country, right? And to win the argument and to say, I want to do this. Are people with me? Nowadays, there's a lot of people theorise about it's the the end of history. There is an alternative, Thatcher and all of that. But nowadays, people consider winning is really to get to number 10.
Yeah.
Maybe do a year or two, go into a fancy private sector job afterwards, Like the people that are involved in politics now, do we think that any of them really care about their vision for the country? I don't feel it, honestly. You okay?
I want to sneeze, but it won't come.
Okay. I thought you were shocked at what I was saying. I think that's why we get to this stage where people feel the need within parties to put forward a unified approach, a united front, so that they can win and beat the opposition. And then there's all this internal wrangling that's done in secret to try and jostle for position to get to the higher echelons of the party. I mean, there's certain things like, cabinet meetings, for example, in the past would be really long affairs where everybody would get their points out, whereas they became, and I think this was under Thatcher, wasn't it? They became much reduced. I'm not sure if that's right, if it was under Thatcher, but certainly Tony Blair's cabinet meetings would be short affairs. But more importantly, I want to talk about one aspect of what you were saying, because I think you give too much credit to Blair and to Burnham, and I think you're taking it at face value. It doesn't really matter, like, what Blair says. It doesn't, right? And it's weird to think, because he was a Prime Minister for 13 years. And with Tony Blair, we've been discussing this a little bit in the SDP in the Northwest about, should we take what he says? Should we really pay attention to what he says? In some ways, yes, right? Tony Blair was an incredibly talented politician and a bad Prime Minister. I think that is in some ways, I mean, it's arguable, obviously, but I think that's pretty obvious in terms of the legacy he left. But it's silly to also just completely write him off as, he doesn't know anything, because he really is, like, as effective an operator as we've ever had in this country. And just if anybody disagrees, just go and watch a PMQs from that period. He was far head and shoulders above someone like Keir Starmer. The reason I say I think you give him too much credit is because we are still under this illusion that the centre is in the middle of politics. And it's not. Centrism is crazy. Centrism is so extreme. Centrism is what ends up with us as a country incentivising migrants to risk their lives in crossing the Channel, and then justifies that because it says, "Oh, we can't do anything about it. We've signed up to this convention, or we're in this." Centrism is the where we end up with police officers not arresting people if they've stolen less than £200 worth of goods. Right? Centrism is crazy. I would say that we in the SDP, we are the new moderates. Right? We are moderate because the moderate acceptable level of illegal immigration is 0. Right? If anybody would like to argue and say, actually, it's about, 5 or 10 people should, try and cross the Channel a year, then they can do. But I would argue that the moderate and most of the public is there and saying, of course it should be 0. That's what we should aim for. The same with crime and law and order. We want to have a strong state that can do these things. We need to escape the trap that is set for us by Blair and Burnham and people of lining ourselves up ideologically somewhere on that spectrum, because the spectrum is not, Ed Davey is not moderate. Ed Davey's crazy, right?
Yeah.
I'm sure he's a lovely man. I'm not, attacking him personally. Also with Burnham, I would be very confident in saying that when Burnham has read the essay and heard the speeches, his team is saying, right, we have to find a way to oppose this, because it's political suicide to just say, oh, Tony Blair's right, because the public are so against that, what Tony Blair represents, of that old politics that the public are rebelling against. You think of Brexit and the rise of reform. So Burnham is being tactical in making sure he finds something to disagree with. And Burnham came out quite quickly, and the BBC headline was, Tony Blair doesn't mention inequality once. Because he's found something that speaks to people. We think of Greens, and Zach Polanski's doing really well talking about problems with inequality. And he's found something that he can use as a wedge to separate him and Blair. Streeting then came out the same day with something similar, and the BBC had to say Burnham and Streeting disagree, because Streeting doesn't want to be put in the same bracket as Blair, even though he is pretty much a Blairite. Interestingly, even Starmer said Tony Blair's wrong.
Yeah.
They're all trying to distance themselves from him. So Tony Blair can come out and say something that is pretty sensible, something about net zero and how we need to get, change direction on that. I think you and I would agree with that. A lot of other people would agree with that. It's quite sensible. But somehow people don't like it because of what he represents. And what people say, what politicians say, is more than just the words they use. We mentioned strong and stable from Theresa May.
Yeah.
People didn't hate strong and stable because they disagreed with the notion that we should be a strong and stable country. They disagreed with it because it was rubbish. And they knew it was rubbish. They knew that it was just words. It was just a slogan. It was empty. And so we have to get back to a point in our politics where we say what we mean and people actually know we mean that. And that's the challenge. That's the challenge for us as a party in the SDP. It's the challenge for what Burnham's trying to do in Makerfield. That's what people should be judging politicians on. Like, do they actually mean what they say? And to peel under the, to scratch the surface a little bit and see whether it actually adds up.